You've probably spent your whole life shedding tears, sometimes for people who never once cried for you. You've cried from the crushing weight of feeling too much, from absorbing pain that wasn't even yours to begin with, from the exhaustion of caring so deeply, so constantly, that it split you open time and time again. Your tears became your emotional pressure valve, your signal of deep sensitivity, your personal stamp of empathic truth. But there comes a moment, maybe it's on the horizon, or maybe it's already arrived, when something inside begins to shift, to dry up. Not out of bitterness, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've started transforming. This transformation, which Carl Jung devoted decades to understanding, marks a radical shift in emotional processing, and it's a change that makes you, the empath, psychologically unstoppable. Jung discovered that for empaths, crying is not always about healing or emotional release. In fact, it often serves deeper, more unconscious psychological mechanisms designed to help you survive, but which also keep you trapped in repetitive cycles of helplessness. The real turning point isn't when you stop crying due to suppression. It's when the tears no longer need to fall, when your psyche has evolved past the old coping mechanism into something far more powerful. When that shift occurs, something extraordinary happens. The energy that used to drain out through your tears becomes available. Suddenly, it's accessible for intentional action, for holding your boundaries, for navigating with clarity, for channeling that emotional intensity into movement that changes things. This is the kind of inner force that can't be shaken by external chaos. It's a centered, strategic, unshakable strength. Today, we're diving deep into what Jung referred to as the tears protocol, an in-depth look at what crying really means for empaths, why the tears eventually stop, what that cessation means in terms of psychological development,
and how a post-tears empath becomes an unstoppable force.
Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in Kessville, Switzerland, into a family steeped in spiritual inquiry and psychological complexity. His father, a Protestant pastor, immersed Jung in theological and existential questions from an early age, questions about the soul, about suffering, and about the relationship between consciousness and something greater. These early influences shaped his lifelong approach to psychology. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Jung didn't see human emotion as something to fix or diagnose. He saw it as the very material of transformation. Jung's work with Sigmund Freud, beginning in 1906, gave him a foundation in psychoanalytic theory, but their paths soon diverged. Freud focused heavily on sexuality and childhood trauma, while Jung pushed further, developing what he called analytical psychology, a framework deeply concerned with archetypes, individuation, and the integration of the unconscious mind.
Jung wasn't just interested in what broke people. He was fascinated by what could heal them, and more importantly, how they could evolve through their emotional experiences, rather than be destroyed by them.
His theories gave rise to groundbreaking texts, Psychological Types, 2 essays on analytical psychology, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, and Aeon. But among his most personal and transformative discoveries was what he uncovered in his work with highly sensitive individuals. Today, we know these individuals as empaths. Jung noticed their emotional responses were unique, intense, and often debilitating, but they also contained untapped potential. He observed that empaths cried often, deeply, and sometimes over things that didn't even involve them. At first, it seemed cathartic, but the more Jung listened, the more he noticed that for many of these individuals, crying wasn't actually about release. It was about something else, something deeper. He began to realize that their tears weren't always healing. They were functioning as part of a survival system, one that kept them disempowered. Jung's deeper investigations revealed 3 core functions of tears in the lives of empaths, and only one of those was about genuine emotional release. The first function he identified was what he termed energetic discharge. Empaths absorb immense amounts of emotional and psychological energy from their surroundings. It's not just what they feel, it's what they absorb from others, from environments, from collective suffering. That absorbed energy needs to go somewhere, and for many empaths, it escapes through tears. When they cry, they feel better, but only temporarily. It's like releasing steam from a pressure cooker. The problem, Jung realized, is that this process doesn't allow the empath to store, integrate, or transform that energy. It's constantly being vented, leaving no reserves for long-term action, growth, or resilience.
Think of it like a leaking battery. No matter how much you try to charge it, it never holds enough energy to power anything substantial. Jung warned that this habitual release prevents the buildup of inner power. Without retained emotional energy, the empath remains stuck in reactive cycles, always feeling, always drained, never fully stepping into their potential. So, what if, instead of releasing that emotional intensity every time it builds, you could learn to hold it, work with it, and convert it into something useful? That's where the real transformation begins. The second function Jung identified is what he called self-punishment through tears. This is more insidious because it's unconscious. It happens when crying becomes a way to punish yourself for feeling too much. The world often treats sensitivity like a flaw, too emotional, too dramatic, too fragile. Over time, empaths internalize that message, and their tears become a sort of confirmation. See, I can't handle this. I'm weak. Paradoxically, this type of crying can feel like a safe identity, like a permission slip to stay small, to stay dependent, to avoid the hard work of growth. It confirms the role of the wounded one, the delicate soul who isn't built for this harsh world. Jung documented cases where individuals unconsciously used their tears to avoid responsibilities, to be taken care of, or to remain in a state of perpetual victimhood. One case stood out in his writings, a young woman who cried constantly. She described herself as a raw wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. In therapy, Jung helped her discover that her tears weren't just spontaneous expressions of emotion. They were performing a role. Her tears made her appear vulnerable, special, and exempt from accountability. She had learned, probably since childhood, that tears would protect her, shield her, and even attract the care she longed for. Jung helped her peel back that layer, not by shaming her, but by helping her see the pattern and question its usefulness. What began to emerge underneath the tears was a suppressed, unacknowledged core of the emotion that had never been properly felt. Anger, grief, confusion, and more importantly, a deep fear of stepping into responsibility and power. The third function Jung named might be the most controversial: tears as manipulation. Now, before jumping to conclusions, Jung made a clear distinction. This isn't always intentional. Most of the time it's not. Empaths aren't trying to manipulate anyone. But over time, their nervous systems can learn that crying produces certain outcomes. It makes people stop arguing. It softens conflict. It pulls focus to their pain and halts uncomfortable discussions. Without even realizing it, they begin to use crying as a defense mechanism against emotional discomfort, accountability, or confrontation. Jung saw this pattern clearly in session. A client might begin to cry just as the conversation turns to something difficult, perhaps feedback, conflict,
or a need that contradicts their own. The tears divert the interaction. The other person backs down. The empath gets relief, but at the cost of growth. Again and again, Jung witnessed tears functioning not just as release, but as avoidance. And avoidance prevents evolution. Jung's approach wasn't about shaming empaths for these unconscious strategies. In fact, he deeply understood that these crying patterns developed as survival mechanisms, especially in childhood environments where a direct expression of needs or confrontation wasn't safe. For many empaths, tears were the only tool they had to communicate distress, to protect themselves, or to shift relational dynamics in their favor. But while this tool may have helped in early life, it becomes limiting in adulthood. What once protected you can start to imprison you. That's why Jung's tears protocol begins with what he called the recognition of function. This is where the real work starts. It's not about forcing yourself to stop crying. It's about getting radically honest about what your tears are doing. Not what you think they're doing, not what you wish they were doing, but what they actually accomplish in your life. To aid this process, Jung often had his patients keep what he called a tears journal. Every time they cried, they were to write down the trigger, the feelings that preceded the tears, what happened during the crying, and what changed afterward. Over time, patterns would emerge. Some people noticed they cried most often when feeling powerless. Others saw a link between crying and being held accountable. Some found they cried most when they were alone and needed to process the emotional noise of everyone else's energy. This step is critical because it takes something automatic and unconscious and brings it into conscious awareness. And as Jung often said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. By observing and analyzing your own emotional behavior, you start to gain choice, power, direction. The next stage of the protocol is what Jung termed containment practice. This is not suppression. This is not stuffing your feelings down. Containment is about creating space between the impulse to cry and the act of crying. It's learning to pause, to sit with the raw emotional energy without automatically discharging it. In therapeutic sessions, Jung would practice this with clients in real time. When they felt tears coming, he'd gently ask them to pause, not to block the feeling, but to stay with it, to describe the sensation, to name what was truly present beneath the urge to cry. What he found was astonishing. Beneath the tears, there was often something sharper and more potent: rage, shame, helplessness, grief. These were not vague waves of emotion. They were specific, rich sources of insight and energy. One patient described the experience of containment as like holding a live wire. The energy surged through her, uncomfortable and intense. But as she stayed with it, something transformed. She realized that beneath the tears was anger at being silenced, at being treated like she was fragile, at being conditioned to think her emotions were liabilities instead of signals. And once she accessed that rage without short-circuiting through tears, it became fuel. It gave her clarity, boundaries, momentum. This is the alchemy Jung was pointing to. Emotional energy, when not immediately discharged, becomes available for transformation. It doesn't vanish, it converts. It fuels action, insight, and strength. But only when the individual has learned to hold it, to contain it, to stay present with it long enough to access its wisdom. Jung used the metaphor of alchemy to describe this inner process. In traditional alchemy, base metals were transformed into gold, but only in a sealed vessel where heat and pressure could build. If that vessel had a leak, the transformation wouldn't occur. For the empath, tears are often that leak.
The moment emotional pressure builds, they cry and the energy escapes before it can become something new. Containment seals the vessel. It holds the pressure, and under that pressure, transformation becomes possible. This leads us to one of Jung's most profound insights. When tears stop, transformation begins, but only if the cessation comes from healing, not repression. There's a crucial distinction here. Suppression is when you still feel like crying, but you force yourself not to. You clench your jaw, hold your breath, fight the emotion. That's not power, that's disconnection. Jung's method doesn't advocate for this. What Jung observed instead was what he called natural cessation. A moment arrives when you're faced with something that once would have triggered tears, and yet the impulse to cry simply isn't there. You're not holding back. You're just not pulled under by the wave. The energy inside you doesn't spill out. It moves differently, through you instead of out of you. This moment is subtle, but transformative. One of Jung's clients, a man who had cried all his life, described it this way. I found myself in a deeply emotional situation. Someone I love was suffering. I felt it all intensely. But instead of crying, I just became very quiet, very focused. My mind was clear. I still cared, but I wasn't overwhelmed. I knew what needed to be done, and I did it. And afterward, I realized I had never felt so strong. This is the hallmark of true transformation. Emotional intensity without collapse. The capacity to feel deeply and remain intact. Jung believed that this was one of the highest psychological achievements for sensitive individuals, a developmental leap he called the maturation of the feeling function. The empath who reaches this level no longer needs tears to prove they feel. They no longer mistake breakdown for authenticity. They feel it all, and yet they remain steady. They respond from a place of clarity, not crisis. And in that clarity, they find power. But what actually causes this shift? What leads to the end of automatic crying and the beginning of containment-based strength? According to Jung, there are 3 key conditions that make this evolution possible. The first is what he called the exhaustion of catharsis. This happens when you've cried for so long, so often, that you begin to see the pattern. You recognize that the same things keep making you cry and nothing is changing. The relief you get from crying is fleeting. The situations stay the same, the people stay the same, the suffering stays the same. And something inside you finally says, this isn't working. That moment, when crying stops feeling useful, is the first opening to change. The second condition is the recognition of energy loss. This happens when you start noticing how depleted you feel after crying, not just tired, but drained in a deeper way. You begin to ask, what if all that emotional energy could be used differently? What if, instead of discharging it, I could channel it? That questioning triggers the desire to contain rather than release. It marks the beginning of conscious energy stewardship. And the third condition is the most important, the development of alternative responses to powerlessness. For many empaths, tears are a reflex to feeling helpless. If you can't stop suffering your own or someone else's, you cry. If you can't change someone's behavior, you cry. If you feel overwhelmed by the state of the world, you cry. But crying is just one way to respond to powerlessness. It's not the only way. And when you begin to develop real power boundaries, direct communication, action, you no longer need tears to cope. The more capable you become, the less you default to collapse.
Jung saw this again and again with his patients. As they grew stronger, more clear, more assertive, the tears simply faded. Not overnight, not all at once, but steadily. They weren't forcing anything. Their nervous system was simply learning a new way to handle intensity. One case from Jung's clinical notes perfectly illustrates this process. A woman in her 30s came to him having cried almost daily for years. She cried about her traumatic childhood, her strained marriage, her work stress, even the suffering she saw in the news. She described herself as too sensitive for this world. Jung didn't try to take her tears away. He didn't tell her to toughen up. Instead, he invited her to look at what her crying was accomplishing and what it was costing her. Together, they explored how her tears functioned. She began to see how crying gave her an identity, someone who had been deeply hurt, someone who deserved compassion, someone who didn't have to carry the full weight of her responsibilities. Her tears bought her emotional space, but they also kept her from stepping into action. They distanced her from growth. Jung guided her to ask a terrifying but liberating question. Who would I be if I weren't the woman who cries? That question changed everything. It led her down a path of rebuilding her identity, one not rooted in emotional fragility, but in strength. One that honored her sensitivity but didn't collapse under it. Over time, as she practiced containment and began taking action in situations where she would have once cried, something began to shift. The tears came less often. The emotional surges were still there, but they no longer ruled her. She learned to stay present, to stay grounded. Eventually, she reached a point where weeks, then months went by without crying. Not because she was numb, but because she was no longer collapsing into tears to process emotion. She had new tools. She had power. She wasn't a victim of her empathy anymore. She was its master. Jung noted that when this type of transformation occurs, the individual experiences a kind of emotional rebirth. The first major change is what he called the availability of focused power. All that energy that used to leak out through tears becomes usable. People in this state can pursue goals with clarity, hold boundaries with consistency, and take on challenges with emotional stamina. They don't flinch from hard conversations. They can witness suffering without falling apart, and because of that, they can actually help more effectively. They feel deeply, but they no longer get stuck in that feeling. Instead, they use it. Emotion becomes fuel, not an obstacle. The second major change is a shift from reactive to proactive. When you cry easily and often, you're in a constant state of reaction. Life throws something at you, and you respond with overwhelm. You recover, and then it happens again. You're always playing defense. But when tears stop, when energy is retained, you shift into a creative position. You begin shaping your life instead of being shaped by it. Jung believed this shift was only possible when you had emotional reserves, and emotional reserves only build when you stop discharging every time things get intense. It's not about being emotionless. It's about becoming strategic with your emotional energy. That's what containment makes possible. The third and most powerful transformation is what Jung called the development of psychological authority. This is a specific kind of inner leadership. It means you're no longer expecting others to handle your feelings for you. You don't need people to tiptoe around your sensitivity. You don't need the world to adjust itself to your overwhelm. You can hold your emotional experience yourself. You become trustworthy, not because you never feel, but because you can handle what you feel. And when that happens, something incredible unfolds. People start treating you differently. They bring you the truth. They stop managing your reactions. They respect your presence. Your emotional steadiness creates space for authenticity, for connection, for mutual empowerment. That is real influence, not based on fragility, but on capacity. But Jung also issued a warning. He observed that in the early stages of this transformation from chronic tears to contained power, there's a very real danger: the temptation of hardness. When someone who has felt fragile for years suddenly experiences the strength that comes from not crying, they might swing too far in the other direction. They start to take pride in their ability to hold back tears. They begin to judge others who still cry. They mistake suppression for strength and equate emotional control with superiority. Jung saw this repeatedly. People who had just learned to contain their emotions would sometimes adopt a posture of coldness, not because they no longer felt, but because they were afraid of slipping back into vulnerability. It became a kind of defensive rigidity. They weren't fully transformed yet. They were just gripping tightly to the appearance of strength. One patient described this phase perfectly. "After I stopped crying, I felt powerful for the first time in my life. But soon, I started looking down on people who still cried. I thought they were weak. What I didn't realize was that I was terrified. Terrified that I could lose my new strength, that I might collapse again. So I judged others to protect myself from that fear." Jung helped her see the truth. True containment is not the same as emotional suppression. Containment still allows you to feel fully. It just doesn't let the feeling run the show. Suppression, on the other hand, disconnects you from your emotions entirely. And disconnection is not empowerment. It's just another kind of prison. That's why Jung's tears protocol included what he called maintenance practices, ongoing methods for staying in alignment with authentic emotional power. The first of these practices was conscious energy management. This means regularly checking in with yourself. Where is my emotional energy going? Am I discharging it automatically or containing it for transformation? Some emotions, Jung acknowledged, should be discharged, like grief over real loss, joy that needs to be expressed, or anger that benefits from healthy release. But the key is awareness. Are you choosing your response or just defaulting to the path of least resistance? The second maintenance practice was developing alternative emotional channels. When tears stop, the emotional energy doesn't vanish. It still needs movement. Jung encouraged his patients to find outlets where their intensity could be transformed. Creative work, physical activity, strategic communication, activism, artistic expression. One artist he worked with discovered that when she stopped crying, her paintings became more raw, more alive. The emotion once lost through tears was now flowing into her work, and it was transforming both her and her audience. The third and perhaps most crucial maintenance practice was what Jung termed reality testing of containment. This involves asking, is my containment giving me clarity and power? Or is it making me numb? If you feel more alive, more capable, and more connected, then your containment is serving you. But if you feel shut down, emotionally distant, or rigid, then you may have slipped into suppression. Jung taught that containment must be dynamic, fluid, honest, and adaptable. It's not about perfection. It's about presence. You don't lose your empathy when you stop crying. You refine it. In fact, Jung argued that post-transformation empaths are often more empathic than before. Why? Because they can stay present with someone else's pain without falling apart. They can offer genuine support without needing to be comforted themselves. They can witness suffering and still have the energy to do something about it. He called this mature empathy, as opposed to the reactive empathy that collapses under emotional weight. It's the difference between feeling with someone and falling into their pain. It's the ability to be a steady presence rather than a second person in crisis.
To illustrate this evolution toward mature empathy, Jung shared one final case in his writings that encapsulates the full arc of emotional transformation. A woman in her late 20s came to him overwhelmed by sorrow, burdened by a traumatic past, and paralyzed by fear about the future. In every session, she cried about her childhood, her relationships, her self-doubt. Her tears were constant, flooding each moment, and yet they never brought her clarity or progress. Jung didn't tell her to stop crying. Instead, he walked her through the tears protocol, first identifying the functions of her tears, then slowly building her capacity for containment. Together, they examined her unconscious beliefs, that her crying made her worthy of compassion, that tears relieved her from responsibility, that they were her only way of coping with fear. Week by week, she practiced delaying the tears just for a moment to feel what lay beneath them. That pause opened the door to rage, grief, longing, and eventually, empowerment. The process took time, but over months and then years, something shifted. She no longer cried during every difficulty. She began standing up for herself. She made career changes she had avoided for years. She had hard conversations without emotionally unraveling. Eventually, her tears became rare, reserved for moments that truly warranted them, like deep loss or profound beauty. Years later, she wrote Jung a letter. "I haven't cried in 6 months, and I've accomplished more in those months than I did in the 6 years before. Not because I've hardened, but because the energy I used to lose through crying is now building my life. I can handle conflict. I can witness pain without collapsing. I can help others without making it about me. Stopping the tears didn't make me less sensitive. It made me more effective with my sensitivity. And that has changed everything." This, Jung believed, is the heart of transformation. When emotional energy becomes available instead of leaking, when sensitivity fuels action instead of collapse, when you no longer perform your pain but engage with it for change. That's what makes a formerly reactive empath unstoppable. But Jung emphasized that transformation doesn't mean never crying again. After all, tears are part of the human experience. He spoke of a new relationship with tears, one that's intentional, conscious, and sacred. Post-transformation tears are not routine, they're profound. They surface in moments that truly call for them. A devastating goodbye, a transcendent work of art, an act of grace that moves the soul. These tears don't drain you, they renew you. Jung called this capacity the matured feeling function. It's not the absence of emotion, it's the mastery of emotional engagement. The ability to choose whether a feeling needs expression, containment, or transformation. The difference between being controlled by emotions and consciously collaborating with them. In this space, the empath becomes more than someone who feels deeply. They become someone who acts powerfully. Someone who uses their emotion not as a weight to carry, but as a force to move the world. This is the ultimate psychological authority, not because you're detached, but because you're fully connected and fully capable. As Jung often emphasized, psychological authority is not about dominance over others. It's about sovereignty over oneself. It's the earned strength of someone who has navigated their own emotional depths without drowning,
who can hold space for others without losing their center. This kind of authority commands respect, not through intimidation or force, but through demonstrated resilience and inner alignment. When you've moved through the tears protocol, you stop needing others to manage your emotional landscape. People no longer feel like they have to walk on eggshells around you, afraid that any truth or tension will cause a breakdown. Instead, they recognize your capacity. They feel safer because you're strong enough to feel deeply without collapsing. That strength is magnetic. It draws people in, not for protection, but for partnership, for real connection, for shared truth. Jung noted that those who master this emotional maturity often become leaders, not necessarily in title, but in energy. They're the ones others look to when things get hard. They're trusted not because they never feel, but because they've proven they can feel and act. They've become a grounded presence in a world full of emotional reactivity. However, Jung also warned that this transformation isn't a one-time event. It's a lifelong practice. That's why he emphasized the need for protocol maintenance. Just like a muscle, your capacity for emotional containment needs exercise. Life will always present new challenges, new emotional triggers, new moments where old patterns want to resurface. And in those moments, you must return to your practices.
One of the most essential maintenance tools is awareness of your current state. Jung taught his patients to ask themselves regularly, am I containing my emotion for transformation or suppressing it out of fear? The answer to that question determines whether you're on the path of growth or regression. Another crucial tool is deliberate emotional expression, not through unconscious tears, but through conscious release. This might mean journaling, movement, art, prayer, or meaningful conversation. The point isn't to avoid emotion, it's to choose how and when it's expressed, so it serves your evolution, rather than drains your power. Jung encouraged his patients to think of themselves as alchemical vessels, to remember that pressure isn't the enemy, it's part of the process. If you leak every time the heat rises, you'll never transform. But if you can hold that emotional pressure long enough, with presence and intention, something golden emerges. This kind of containment gives birth to a new kind of tears, not frequent, helpless ones, but rare, sacred expressions. One long-term patient of Jung's described this beautifully. I used to cry every day about everything. Now I cry maybe once or twice a year. But when I do, it's like my soul is speaking. It's not weakness. It's release with purpose. And afterward, I don't feel empty. I feel more whole. These sacred tears mark the evolution from emotional reactivity to emotional sovereignty. And with that sovereignty comes a new way of being in the world, one marked by compassion without collapse, empathy without exhaustion, and sensitivity that no longer breaks you but instead builds you. This refined emotional presence is what Jung believed empaths were always meant to embody. Not broken feelers overwhelmed by the world, but powerful forces, capable of understanding, transforming, and acting from their depth of sensitivity. The empath, once seen as fragile, becomes a pillar, not because they've hardened, but because they've learned to contain rather than collapse, to transform rather than simply release. But Jung also addressed a major fear many empaths have, the fear of losing empathy if they stop crying. For those who've built their identity around deep feeling and visible emotion, the idea of no longer crying can feel like a loss, like they're betraying who they truly are. Jung understood this deeply. He never dismissed the emotional experience of empaths. Instead, he redefined empathy. He wrote, Empathy is not measured by tears, but by understanding. The empath who cries constantly isn't necessarily more connected. They may just be overwhelmed. Meanwhile, the one who has developed the strength to stay present with pain without being consumed by it may be far more capable of truly helping. This is what Jung called effective empathy. It's not about joining someone in their emotional spiral. It's about being present enough, strong enough, to hold space for their experience without making it about your own emotional reaction.
It's the kind of empathy that can act, can advocate, can lead. Empaths who move through this transformation often find their compassion becomes sharper, more precise. They're no longer burned out by everyone's pain because they've learned to process emotional input without losing themselves. They don't need to cry to prove they care. Their energy speaks for itself. At the heart of this transformation is choice. The post-tears empath can choose to feel deeply without reacting impulsively, to cry when it's sacred, not when it's habitual, and to use emotional intensity as fuel for growth rather than a drain on their strength. That choice is what marks the difference between psychological immaturity and maturity. Jung's tears protocol isn't about becoming emotionless. It's about stepping into emotional leadership. It's about discovering that all the energy you use to release through tears is the very same energy you can now use to build, to create, to heal, to protect, to inspire. And perhaps most profoundly, it's about no longer needing others to manage your sensitivity. You become your own container, your own guide, your own source of strength. That's when the empath becomes unstoppable, not because they've stopped feeling, but because they've learned to channel their feelings into transformative power. Let this truth settle in. Your sensitivity is not a curse. It's a gift waiting to be mastered. And the moment you stop leaking it through constant emotional discharge is the moment you begin building the life your soul has been aching for. The final message of Jung's work on this subject is one of deep hope. You can change your relationship with emotion without changing who you are at your core. You don't have to become cold, disconnected, or robotic to stop crying. In fact, when done through transformation rather than suppression, you become more of yourself, more centered, more empowered, more capable of expressing the full range of your emotional landscape in intentional, powerful ways. For the empath, this evolution means reclaiming emotional energy that has been leaking out for years, sometimes decades. Imagine all the projects that could have been completed, the relationships that could have been deepened, the boundaries that could have been set, if the energy lost through constant tears had been contained and directed. Jung believed that when this redirection happens, it changes everything. You begin showing up differently in every aspect of your life. In conversations, you stop avoiding difficult topics because you trust your ability to stay grounded. In relationships, you stop needing others to constantly soothe or validate your emotions. You offer presence without dependency. In your work, you bring a level of focus and emotional stamina that others notice. You're no longer derailed by every emotional wave. You ride them, you harness them, and you move forward with intention. And most importantly, you stop seeing your emotional sensitivity as something to be hidden or apologized for. It becomes your power, because now you're not reacting to every trigger. You're responding from a place of clarity. You're not collapsing, you're transforming. If you've recognized yourself in this journey, if you see your own crying patterns reflected in Jung's framework, know this: you are not broken. You're not weak. You're not failing. You're simply standing at the edge of a deeper transformation, and your tears, once constant companions, are inviting you towards something greater. So where are you on this path? Are you still crying constantly? Are you just beginning to explore containment? Have your tears already started to fade? Or are you afraid that letting go of them will mean losing your identity? Wherever you are, know this. Awareness is the beginning. Bringing consciousness to these unconscious patterns is the first act of power. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to our channel right now.
We'll continue to explore these inner transformations, psychological frameworks that don't just describe you, but elevate you. And leave a comment below. Say it honestly, without shame. I cry constantly. I'm learning to contain. My tears have stopped. I'm afraid to stop crying. This space is for honesty, not perfection. Your awareness will inspire others to look inward too. Because sometimes, the most empowering thing we can do for each other is show what transformation actually looks like. Not as a theory, but as a living process. One that unfolds through practice, reflection, and courage. The journey through Jung's Tears protocol is not linear. It may feel like progress one day and regression the next. You might go months without crying and then find yourself unexpectedly overwhelmed. This isn't failure, it's integration. Emotional mastery doesn't mean perfection. It means developing the capacity to navigate intensity with awareness and intention. That's why Jung emphasized compassion for the self throughout the process. The goal is never to shame your tears, but to understand them. Each tear you've shed carried meaning at the time. Each was your psyche's best attempt to cope with what felt unmanageable. But now, you're invited to ask, is this still serving me? Or is it time to evolve? This evolution isn't about becoming stoic in the sense of indifference. It's about becoming emotionally wise. When you reach the point where you no longer cry because your nervous system has integrated your experiences, because you've reclaimed your emotional energy, because you now contain instead of collapse, you're not just surviving anymore. You're stepping into leadership of your own inner world. And that's where the ripple begins. When empaths become stable, centered, and powerful, they become agents of change in their communities. They're no longer the ones who need constant emotional tending. They're the ones who hold space for others, who act when it matters, who listen deeply without being derailed. This is how sensitivity becomes a force for good, not a burden. You become a model of emotional integrity. You show others that it's possible to feel deeply without being ruled by feeling. That it's possible to care profoundly without being consumed. That it's possible to help without collapsing under the weight of others' pain. This is the kind of empathy the world desperately needs. Empathy that empowers, not empathy that exhausts. Jung knew that sensitivity, when matured, becomes something sacred. It becomes the channel through which insight, compassion, and transformation flow. And he believed that those who develop this level of mastery with emotion, especially empaths, are not just personally unstoppable, they are socially transformative. Because when you stop leaking energy through tears, you start building something lasting. When you stop defaulting to collapse, you start constructing clarity. And when you stop identifying with the role of the overwhelmed empath, you start discovering who you really are. A force of nature, rooted in depth, fueled by clarity, and capable of holding emotional storms with unwavering presence. There's one final truth in Jung's Tears protocol. Your sensitivity was never the weakness. It was simply untamed energy. The tears were not the problem. They were how your psyche coped before it had a better way. And now, you do. Containment isn't about blocking your emotions. It's about choosing how and when to express them in ways that serve your growth instead of draining your power. It's learning that you don't have to prove your empathy with constant weeping. Your presence, your clarity, your capacity to hold pain without falling apart, that's empathy refined. As this transformation takes root, the emotional storms don't vanish, but you ride them differently. You no longer get tossed and wrecked by every wave. You develop what Jung called psychic weight. People feel it when they're around you. It's not a performance. It's gravity. It's presence. It's steadiness earned through the fire of your own emotional mastery. And this steadiness allows you to do more with your life. It allows you to show up fully, love deeply, protect wisely, and lead gently. You no longer avoid the hard things. You walk into them with your eyes open and your energy intact. So the next time you feel that surge, the grief, the frustration, the overwhelm, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, does this feeling need to be discharged or transformed? That moment of choice is the foundation of your power. If you've reached this point, it means you're already on the path, one where emotional energy is no longer wasted, but wielded. Don't rush the process. Honor each step. Celebrate each moment of clarity. And most of all, keep showing up for your own growth. Subscribe to our channel if you found strength in this message. Comment below where you are on your journey. Share this with someone whose tears may be ready to transform. You're not becoming less emotional. You're becoming more powerful with your emotions. This is just the beginning.